what do journalists do to cover issues related to a certain regime?
You mean like a difficult regime? Well, it really depends from country to country. I mean, in Egypt, where I live, for instance, the government is very sensitive to what the foreign press says and does, places restrictions on our movements. It remonstrates with journalists about our coverage. It criticises us. They criticise us in the press. So there's certainly a lot of efforts to put pressure on us. But, there's many strategies that people have to deal with that. And I think, to succeed, what most people do is they just try to concentrate on the story at hand, try and tell that as straight as they can, and then the rest, falls as it may.
What do Egyptians think about the case of Giulio Regeni?
Well, there was huge interest in the case of Giulio Regeni, and certainly quite an amount of, anguish, I think, on the part of Egyptians after he died 2 years ago. People felt really bad that this foreigner who was visiting their country had died in such mysterious circumstances, in such a terrible way. But after that, certainly in the press, there was a lot of coverage that clouded the issue, that tried to suggest that, strange forces were behind his death. So I think that really clouded the public conversation about Giulio Regeni. And to be honest, now it's something that is not discussed very much in Egypt. But that's also, I think, partly a function of the fact that the press in Egypt is very tightly pressured by the government. And so there is not freedom of speech to discuss sensitive issues like this openly.
So what are the risks of being a local and a foreign correspondent in Egypt in this context?
Well, they differ greatly, to be honest. Mostly for foreign journalists, the greatest risk is of deportation, even though some have been tried in court, notably in the case of Al Jazeera a number of years ago. But most recently, just before the election, we had a British journalist who's going to be speaking here today, actually, who was deported, apparently without explanation, before the vote. For local journalists, it's a lot more serious. There are several dozen Egyptian journalists who are in jail. People have been put on trial. There's a photographer who has been held without even being charged for 5 years. His name is Shawkan, which is really pretty shocking. So, I think that the risks that local journalists face are exponentially greater. And in fact, just a number of weeks ago, in the run-up to the elections, there were 2 young reporters who were working for a website. They disappeared for a number of days and they turned up to be in police custody. So, local reporters are running a risk, and to be honest, that's why a lot of people have now left the country, because it's an extremely difficult environment to work in.